Thanks everyone for being so patient and watching me struggle with what should be not very technical difficulties. And the stage. I'm going to talk about maturity levels in sourcing today. The reason why I chose this topic is because I've been doing this for 8-9 years now, and I see that our sourcing industry is very much focused on metrics. And metrics are, in many cases, the way a manager and a sourcing manager or a recruitment manager still talks to his team, his or her team. And it sort of takes away some of the other aspects that I think are super important when you hire for a team. And I'm going to talk about a couple of topics that I think are super important in this. I'll mention it in a bit. A bit about me. I'm a Dutch guy. I live in Amsterdam. I also have a dog. She's named Zola. Yes, that is the famous Chelsea striker of the 90s. I'm a Chelsea fan at heart. When I'm not doing recruiting, I like to tune my car. Yeah, where have I worked in the past? I worked at both startups, an e-commerce startup, SEO shop, which we sold to a big retailer in Canada. I worked at ASML, which is a big lithography company. I worked at Facebook, where I hired chief architects, so the most senior engineers that they have in Europe. And they didn't, prior to me, no one had ever done that in Europe, so it was quite interesting having no idea about what to do, basically very little data, and they go, hire us the very senior, most senior people in the world, please. Okay, fine. So I tried and did it. I went to London for that. I worked at Uber, where I hired their engineering leadership in Europe. Again, previously to that, they weren't really doing that with one focused individual. So Uber was hiring through their own engineering managers, like who do you know, how do you build your teams, let's get people over. And then they asked me, hey, maybe you can just streamline it all and help all of our offices in Europe grow. So did that for a while, and now I work at a basically a machine learning boutique for a large consultancy firm, where I globally lead all sourcing efforts. So, what are we going to talk about? Like I said, maturity levels in sourcing. We'll get to that in the slides. I'm going to talk about something that I'd like to coin human debt. And for every one of you who works in technology, you might know the term technical debt. If you don't, I will explain it in one of the slides later. I think there's another really big element that we're ignoring as we're building these teams, as we're so metrically focused in our hiring. It's called human debt. Ties a little bit into the cause and effect thing. It really will affect your culture, doing a good or a bad job on the other aspects of how is your funnel converting? Are you getting a lot of new candidates in process? The story is a bit bigger than that, I think. And for sources, and I've learned from speaking to a couple of people here that not everybody in this country is only a sourcer or a recruiter. I hear that many of you are in a 360 role. Fair enough. For the sake of this presentation, consider yourself to be just as much sourcer as anybody else. And I'll maybe explain a little bit the different flavors that are around it in a bit. So I think you all know what this is. It's a greenhouse, and that's obviously, that's, by the way, also the name of an ATS, but that's also what I think about often when you're building a sourcing function. I mean, you start off knowing very little about the market, about the roles you're hiring for, about your team if you're leading a team. And it's something that takes time to grow. You learn as you do. That's why you need to practice a lot. And yes, you need to involve data in that. You need to, for instance, when you do reach outs, you want to A/B test, right? Am I customizing a reach out? Am I not doing it? What is the result of that? You learn as you go, and the more you learn, the more mature, hopefully not only yourself, but also your team becomes. And over time, as I moved from being an IC sourcer, just an individual sourcer, to basically managing the teams of sourcers and recruiters, mostly sourcers, I found that it's sort of it's a skill that you learn over time, and it's very important to basically understand that there's more aspects to sourcing than all of these things that most of us are talking about. Very specific things. Reach outs, engagement, tools to scrape data from, like all these things are important, but there's basically a more holistic view that you can have the more you grow up in sourcing, where you think, aren't we forgetting about something else here? And that's more or less what I want to talk about today. The same way to look at it, once you're young, you've plenty enough to shout about it, you think you know it all, and then when you grow a bit older, sometimes you realize, I'm not that old by the way, but you realize that, hey, actually, there's more to it. You become a bit more skeptical in your thought, and that's sort of the reason on why I wanted to do this presentation in the first place. So my first statement, I truly believe this, we're all so excited in the sourcing industry to speak about finding a candidate. And yes, it is important, but when we're all honest, we're all probably experts in our fields. We all know how to find a candidate. I mean, every conference that I see again, there's so many people talking about it, and I think, it's preaching to the choir. We're all sourcing candidates. We've passed the years of waiting for our candidates to apply. I mean, we know this. So I think that together with certain things that are happening in the market, for instance, algorithmic solving, like various forms of machine learning, and the industry likes to call it AI, but I don't really think that in recruitment there's tons of actual artificial intelligence happening at this stage. Much of it is algorithmic. If you look at it, finding a candidate is a little bit becoming a limited value offering. It's something that can be almost automized. In many cases, there are tons of tools to help you with it. The sourcing field maybe needs to evolve a bit from that. And again, that's part of what I wanted to do this discussion today. And first, I wanted to start basically with an overview of where recruiting or headhunting or whatever you want to call it, because back in the day, we didn't have the word sourcing, where it all came from. And roughly, whatever source you can find, it sort of starts around the 1940s. It's definitely when I was not around, but certain people were, and they were doing stuff with recruiting. But it was very different. It was Rolodexes, typewriters. I mean, people were using name generators, and they got a lot out of newspapers and journals that they were just translating, highlighting, and basically doing their research, which is actually a beautiful, pure form of doing research, something that we often today forget. Then, and this is 30 years, then in the 80s, okay, that's when things started moving a bit more. Career fairs, computers came into play, actually home computers, so we could actually start playing around with data ourselves for the first time. It's also when you saw the first job boards, applicant tracking systems, actually when a lot of online efforts and tooling came into play for what we now know as partly sourcing and recruiting. There's also when we really started mapping out companies, something that I'm currently still doing a lot for various reasons. I think it's still a beautiful way of doing it. And basically the shift into the 90s was really when everybody got their first access to internet. Not everyone, I was actually maybe a bit late, a few years later myself. But that's when we actually got the power in our own homes to deal with these matters. And at the time, we weren't interacting with candidates that much. It was mostly mapping it out, getting a feel of what the data was doing, and that was more or less it, and then you would hand it over to somebody else who would do the actual recruiting part. And then there's this very large split. I'm going to call it 99 and 2016, but this is sort of the past few years, and I know this is, maybe a little bit short for all the time that we've spent in this field in the last few years, but online job boards became a big thing, employer branding. We were talking about now all of a sudden we have to explain our brand a bit more. Professional networks, LinkedIn and the likes became a serious topic. And also we saw finally sourcing tools came into play. Finally there were people that were thinking, hey, you can actually manipulate data or get more exposure to public data if you use tools for it. And that's also, during this time, is mostly when pure agency recruitment evolved a bit more into people that worked in-house, that would just take up the role of a recruiter or a sourcer and do that work for the business. I'll get more into that later. Source of hire is an expensive thing. If you hire everyone through an agency, that will be super expensive. So that's when we did that. And now there's two waves that we're now basically in. I'm going to call this the fourth wave, and then where I think we're heading to. Honestly, it's more than just finding candidates. I really do think we're talking a lot about engagement currently and about that it's important to not send a copy-paste message to anyone. Hi, name, I'm recruiting for this role. Please send your resume. We know this. So it's more around what do you do with the data behind it? How do you support making a statement that there are no more people to find in a certain country for a certain role? That's sort of the discussions that I have with my team, and I think many people have with their managers, or if they're leading teams, are also having with their teams. Explain why you think a certain market is empty, why we need to change the job, why, etc., etc. That's sort of where we are now, and then supported by lots of tools that claim to do some prediction based on data for you, and these are all the sourcing tools that we know about. But I think that we're missing something that's quite interesting. I've called it for now, and definitely if you find a better name, but fact facilitator, bias eliminator, looking at the translators thinking that it's probably not fun to translate. But what I'm missing is, and I'm not saying that nobody is doing this, but what I see often when I speak to people, I miss a bit of the idea of hiring as a unit, hiring together. I feel that sourcing is sometimes very much on an island with tons of good insights, with great business value to give, but often it's not really shared outside of the recruitment community, meaning your business managers that would love to know about it so that when they want to hire a certain person, they would like your data and your narrative, not only the data, to support why we should make a different decision. It's very siloed. So, and the same goes for interview calibration. I'm sometimes surprised how many people are working in companies where you find a candidate, you do an initial screen, it goes well, and then the candidate goes into an interview process. The candidate buys in from a sourced lead, the candidate becomes an actual candidate, and then we start interviewing. And the faster we need to scale our teams, the faster we want to interview them. But it doesn't necessarily mean that all people are alike, all interview loops, so all set of interviews that you do are exactly the same. And it doesn't mean that every interviewer that you use knows how to how to get that specific signal out of a candidate that makes a story for a source or recruiter to say, we should hire. Often it's just plowing people through the funnel and seeing what sticks. And that's such a shame because sourcing holds so much value in data. The two go hand in hand, and use more of that narrative. That's what I say, facts over narrative and also data and narrative. I think both are important, but basically take it out of there's 100 people in the funnel, 20 went to on-sites, 3 got an offer, and explain why in the interim things happened as they did. Why is there so many decrease? Why? There's a lot of business managers don't know why it is. They only care about, did we hire them? No. Okay, so we're not at our goal yet. Whilst you could have learned a ton of things in the interim, you just didn't explain it. So that's, some of the stuff I want to dig deep into today. And I'm going to start with a quick example. I used to work at Facebook. There's a beautiful Czech man in the back named Andre, who still is. Back in the day, in 2013, Instagram merged into Facebook. And at the time, there were 13 employees at large. And you think, well, Facebook, Instagram, they have tons of money. Like, everything will be fine. They don't have to take notice of anything. Back in the day, they were very small. And they were very much aware of what the changes are when you add one person to a 13-person team. If 13 becomes 14, and if that 14th hire maybe isn't as good as we thought it was, just very good on paper, then it can really hurt your brand. It can hurt your culture. People can decide that all of a sudden it's not so much fun to work in anymore. People can leave. The company was already pretty well aware of this early on. And also, back in the day, they had to watch their cost of hire much more. Like right now, the budgets may be a bit different, but they're already pretty well aware of that. And I think maintaining culture and values as you scale a company is probably the most important thing that you can do. And let me explain why that is. Well, first off, we can all read it. Bad hires cost money and kill companies. I mean, I really think it is. I can dig into what the cost of that actually is. We'll get into that in a bit. But first, let me explain to you the concept of technical debt. And that's something that in engineering is used a lot. And it basically comes down to my favorite source, Wikipedia. And it's basically, it's a form where you build something, a piece of software that becomes bigger. It starts as a very small piece of software and then it grows. And there's more and more work that you need to do to maintain that original piece of software. And at one point it becomes so big that it's really hard to manage. There's tons of dangers in that. And it says literally, if technical debt is not repaid, it can accumulate interest, making it harder to implement changes later on. So when you're small, it's still easy to steer a ship when there's 14 people and you want to make a change, relatively easy. When there's 2,000 of them, and we need to be very conscious of that as we're hiring, we're responsible of that as a team, it's really hard. So it's just not new employees throwing them in a company and thinking it will work out, and if it doesn't, HR will deal with it. You have a sort of moral responsibility to really think about that. And maybe this is where I want to build the bridge. Yes, this is the elephant in the room. I like poor jokes. Human debt, which is the same thing. You can have a team that grows. You don't really feel that something's changing up until it's so big that now it's really hard to maintain and people are unhappy, and all of a sudden what happens? You don't feel it as you're hiring, as more offers are accepted, as you're growing the team, as you're making your target as a source. That sounds so great, but there's this bigger responsibility that I think tons of companies are missing. And if you're an agency, maybe you go, well, that's the problem of my client because they hired me and I hired this one person and it's fine. But for tons of us, I think there's a bit of a gap there that we should think about. How to compare this? Metrics. We love metrics. So everything when it's about return on investments, either whether it's the companies that we grow, the amount of funding that we get, financial support from backers that want to grow the company, all these things, we think it's great. It's just amazing. Then what we forget is that there's also the other aspect. Well, we don't forget about it, but it's sort of we don't talk about it as much. It's her. Look at how happy she is. She's happy now. Team's still small. And then you hire people. Hire a few, hire a bit more. And then before you know it, outside of the fact that you're really not looking into your diversity split, you have a bigger team. And as long as things go well and they're managed well, you're lucky. But if you don't have proper focus as a sourcer early on the same metrics that you screen against for cultural values, anyone could get hired. That also means it's great to have different opinions, like diversity of thought, if you will, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a great team. A lot will be left up to chance. And if you're lucky, you have great managers who can feel that, but that means they'll have to fire a few people, have to hire new people. There's lots of tumultuous situations going on. And that's basically this situation where she just won't be very happy. So on the cost of that hire, is it expensive? Yes. If you think about initial hiring cost, the total compensation of the employee itself, let's say they're not working out, you have to figure out a way to fire them. That costs money, so severance packages. Don't even forget the human mistakes that either the employee makes that isn't functioning or that the team is making because you have a few bad employees. Think about the missed business opportunities your company has, and think about all the time spent of one of your poor employees just nagging away at good functioning employees, taking their time away that they should actually spend and focus on work. There's various estimates, but whatever, there's so many zeros in these numbers, I'm going to go with it's expensive, you don't really want it to happen. So it can sneak up on you, really. It can ruin your company, and sadly, you're a little late when you notice usually. So I think that there's basically a difference between being very data-driven in recruitment versus actually trying to find the great talent there. There's a disconnect in the reason where we're just so focused on the metrics and think that the metrics are the only truth to that we sort of forget about what were we originally doing. What was the goal of sourcing? You want to build a sustainable business, a good brand, which is, which can throw a punch and which is not very unstable. Then, if we think about what are we really looking at out of sourcing, it's often these numbers. Numbers of candidates identified, numbers of engaged, numbers of brought into process. Often, when teams grow, managers, the only way they really connect with the team is to ask these numbers every week, every month. And that's also part of the risk. I mean, dangers of applying only these metrics is you become too metric focused. Losing track of basically, I call it the non-binary element of sourcing, namely, what's the narrative? What was actually, why are we doing these things? Why the values? Why should we focus on culture? Because on paper, it's really easy to get people hired, especially if your hiring team is not as much as aware as you are. So you want to build basically an organization where people want to work in. Other hindering factors, GDPR came into play, so we only have 30 days left to analyze sourcing data. So all the sourcing screens that you do, we only have 30 days where we can just all look at the data and go, this makes sense, this makes no sense. Important there is, many sources don't use the same set of data. Sourcer A uses her own questions, sourcer B uses his own questions. You don't really get a good set of data to analyze and go, this makes sense, this makes no sense, we should or we should not hire this person. It's all just out of the eye of the beholder. And where we do still have data and we can have the 30 days to analyze them, we become so focused on it that we're just totally over-pivoting to having a metric discussion. And then the last part maybe to this is sources get assessed through the metrics. Usually a lot of the conversations around performance in sourcing or recruiters is how many hires, offers, all these things. Yes, that's part of the game. But you could be a great sourcer or recruiter, and the reason why you didn't make a hire is because you thought it wasn't good for the brand to get this person hired in the first place. It was doing bigger damage other than just you having +1. I hired another person. Yay, I can celebrate. Maybe that wasn't the biggest investment to make. Maybe it was the best call to actually go, don't hire them. But I see that, honestly, I haven't heard that a lot. People going, nah, I could have hired the person, but we didn't. It's always, well, we do. We're going to push the offer. I want to have that +1. I want to have another offer. I want to have another hire. So where has the focus really gone? Please don't tell me that you think that your hiring team, your business managers know everything about hiring. I mean, I love working with them, but they are good at building software or data science in my environment. They are not recruiting experts. That's why they have, you lot. Example here, you're growing a company, it goes from 14, and then there's a big financial backer, and they give you millions, and they go, grow the company. We want to grow, we want to go to the stock market. Lots of people added, please. Grow the teams. Next year, 100 new hires. I mean, how many in this room actually are faced with this notion sometimes? That means all of the focus on, let's look at the data, let's look at what everybody's saying, let's look at who we really do want to hire and who do we not. It just disappears in front of a big funnel metric of how many people did we identify, how many people got into the process. There's no deeper analytics on it anymore. Can be dangerous. So yeah, your boardroom could ask you, refactor the code base, something, again, engineering people understand. Yeah, okay, engineers can do that. Give us some time and it will be refactored. But if you ask the question, can we also refactor the employees? No, they're humans. You hire them, they're in the company. And depending on the country where you are, it's actually really hard to also fire them. And do you really want to fire people? You want to make sure people can grow. And part of growing is not everybody is suitable for the company, but you want to make sure most of them can build a business. You don't want to have this churn all the time going on. Jackie Chan thinks the same, it's crazy. So there you are, you're officially screwed. You've hired a bunch of people based on your funnel metrics, and oh, does it look good? 20 offers in the half, amazing. But they're not functioning well. Ain't that great? And as a result, your culture can really go to shits. There's no other way of saying it. Your competitors will win. And especially when you're not that large, especially when you're not the biggest brand in the world, it can really do damage. And let's be honest, that's not why we're doing this. That's not why we're hiring. Not for our own ego to say we're growing teams, we're amazing. We're hiring this for a brand, for an employer, which we want to be successful. So how to fix it? And adding here, I think a lot of recruiters are focused on the short term. What is my bonus? And I don't think everybody's focused on that. But what's the gain for me? What's my promotion? What's my visibility? Where can I speak on stage? Jokingly. Versus, what's the long-term successfulness of my hires? Are they staying for a long time? What's the retention there? Are they leaving us really too soon, to be honest? Where's that reflective behavior? I don't really see that a lot. It's sort of, HR will deal with that. Bye. Find that interesting. So, basically my advice is don't live on an island. Not saying that you guys do, but maybe it's something to think about a bit more. And in whatever form you work together as a sourcer, as a recruiter combination, work together, collaborate on this, but give more explanation to what it is that you're doing. Make more accurate assessments before you move people to a funnel and basically just shove offers down the road and get people hired and put them all in and think that all things will be well. So maybe a few things that I wanted to explain to basically help you create a bit more maturity in your hiring. I think building interview screening documents would be a good one. Assessing against the same set of criteria. If I have a team, and I currently do, of a couple of sources who work in the same thing, data science, for instance, and they work globally, one's in Asia focus, one's US, and sourcer A asks a lot of different questions than sourcer B. How are we assessing who is good? What's the metric? There is no metric. It's just Jan, for instance, think it's answer A, Yves will think it's answer B. There is no consistency in that data. It doesn't work. Create good interview preparation documents for your candidates. Often, when I speak to companies, they just throw a candidate onto an interview, an on-site interview, and they give very little explanation about what to prepare for. You can't expect a candidate to know everything. And the more senior candidates get, the harder it will be for them to still know what interviewing was like. So they can be great on paper. They can be the most insane engineer you'll ever meet. If they don't know how your company is looking at interviewing, likely they will fail. So it's about explaining a lot of preconditions about this is how to interview at our company without giving the actual answer to make them prepare for it. Then also, selling is not recruiting, only recruiting focused. I mean, there's tons of businesses that do this well, there's also tons that don't. Don't always rely on your own, we call it cultivation. If you are really good at selling your company to a candidate, that's great, but there's tons of people that aren't, and there's definitely tons of hiring managers that can help you, yet we are not utilizing them. I think that's a bit strange because the hiring manager ultimately wants this person hired, not you. You're just there to support them. So a little bit more focus on that, meaning it's not just recruiting who's presenting or selling the candidate. you can do a lot with that and yield a lot of results, and also make the business part of the solution, not just the business going, I have a problem, I need to hire, get me people, and that will be it. A few other things, train your interviewers. It's not about nice conversations, it's about actually getting hiring signal. It's a few arguments about a specific interview that you want to get, and if you don't find those arguments, apparently the candidate didn't perform well. There's a lot of instances that I see where I just go, where's the signal on why we're hiring this candidate? It's just a lot of good conversation, yeah, great, but that's not really what I was looking for. So prepare your business on doing exactly that for that interview. And that also ties into good interview feedback. This is data we actually can store in our ATS. So that when you read through it and there's a debrief, we all meet together and we discuss if we're going to offer yes or no, that you actually have some good feedback to read through. And dare to pass on great candidates that are just great on paper. Oh, this amazing engineer from da-da-da. Maybe there is no hiring signal. The interviews just weren't that good. Be prepared to pass, because if you really know what you're hiring for and that person didn't show it, pass. And then maybe bias. I'm sure it got discussed once or twice here. Bias is a big thing. I have my bias about certain things. I think everybody does. Make sure that you have returning, like often training on managing your own bias. You could be in an interview or screening a candidate thinking that you know, but if you screen 1,000 of them, you already think that, oh, he's giving this answer, likely it will be. No, it's a new interview, don't do that. Don't compare the 1 and the 2. And I see that a lot. Maybe last few, because I'm running out of time here. Shield interview feedback. Don't let hiring managers talk about candidates after they interviewed them. Don't let them influence each other. Make sure that they shield that interview. Keep it private. If you have a good ATS, it's hidden from them. They will only see it when we're at debrief, when we discuss all feedback and whether we find hiring signal to actually offer yes or no. I see a lot of companies that love to share the feedback before that. So train your recruiter in presenting the candidate well. During hiring committee, I mean, if the recruiter doesn't even know how to sell the candidate and doesn't have hiring signal, then why are we still hiring? And use sources when closing the candidate, because the sources actually know what the candidate really liked in the first place. So they're super valuable at the end. I'm getting the last few slides. And now, maybe for Czech Republic, isn't this something the recruiter should be doing? Well, if a sourcer really doesn't drive the process and is responsible for the narrative around hiring, candidates really won't go through the funnel well. And it will be this metric discussion with nothing else. It will just be a hollow shell with people, 100 numbers, 20 offers, 3 declines, 1 hire. You need more context there. Take that ownership. So hire for culture, hire for culture and team fit over actually just hitting your numbers. Your job is bigger than just your numbers. Think about the long-term success of a business, not just the hires on the short term. And think about retention from day one. Bad employees are not HR's problem, they're your problem because you decided to move them through the funnel with maybe no good hiring signal. Basically it. I've run out of time, but time for questions?
You are totally out. Okay, I have to thank you. We will give 2 questions. One is here, second one, and then your friend Honza. We should switch people. So, how to ensure that sourcing recruiting has the power in the first place to influence hiring managers?
Well, that's a lot about the discussion that you have. If you stay in the corner as sourcing and recruiter to basically not chat to your hiring manager, you will never have that conversation. So it's about getting as close to them as possible to make sure they understand you actually have value. If you're just there like some service that you use to get me more leads, get me new candidates, that's a little easy. The hiring manager should understand you're the expert. So get very close to them and constantly have a discussion around what do we want to do, how do we want to achieve it, and let them correct you and correct them. But if it's 2 separate islands, then you'll always have a tough discussion.
Okay. And we need to switch. So
yeah, we
sorry,
need to switch.
Yves will be outside, you know, outside. So next to door, you can discuss with him more. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.